And when you think about being creative, you might think about eminent creators that might pop to mind immediately, an Einstein or a Picasso or a Mozart. What's notable about that type of individual is that they are, not only is their work beautiful and elegant, but that the creations that they generated were created for their own sake. They weren't created for some kind of organizational purpose. Einstein did not create his special and general theories of relativity out of some need to satisfy an employer. Picasso did not generate his cubism and his paintings over 50 and 60 years out of some need to satisfy a social purpose or a social good. Mozart was not trying to satisfy a sponsor with his beautiful symphonies. And in fact, the sponsor Mozart had did not want the music that he was created, wanted something much more mundane. So when we think about creativity, especially in an artistic and scientific sense, we think about novelty and originality for its own sake. But we know that organizations are quite different because our organizations, whether they're for-profits or non-profits, have a purpose. They have a mission, a set of goals and a set of objectives that really serve as the reasons for their existence. And so creativity in an organization looks different. We're not likely to accept creative activity that's just creative for its own sake. Gee, that's creative, but it doesn't do us any good. Instead, creativity has to have a second component to it. It not only involves novelty or originality, but it also involves usefulness or practicality. And so that's the definition of creativity that we have used for this period of time when we look at creativity in the workplace and when we say that something is enhancing an employee's and a work group's ability to be creative in the workplace. One thing that's also worth noting about that definition, if you think about it for a moment, that means that creativity is not the same everywhere. We know that creativity is quite different, for instance, in different cultures. It's viewed differently. Indian culture versus Chinese culture versus U.S. culture views creativity quite differently. I've conducted creativity research in all of those settings, and it's very notable how socially and organizationally creativity is viewed differently. It's also important to bear in mind that what ultimately is in the workplace is considered creative down the line is a function of what the market deems as creative or innovative. Practices such as employee governance are old hat and have existed for hundreds of years in academic workplaces. But in other workplaces, and so they wouldn't be novel in this workplace. In other workplaces, they would be quite novel and new because the market sees it quite differently. A very different industry and a very different market. Bearing this definition in mind, let me highlight, before I describe the research, three things that really are required for employees to be creative. This particular graphic and these ideas come from Teresa Amabile at Harvard, who's done a great deal of work in creativity. Credit where credit is due, because it's excellent work. Basically, the idea behind creativity for employees is that three basic things are required. The first is fairly simple, and it's what all employees require: resources to get their job done. Now, this could be staff and money, but more importantly, I'm really thinking about time and information. Creativity requires expertise in an area. Creativity very often involves a synthesis of putting things together. If you don't have the building blocks of knowledge to put things together, it's very hard for you to be creative when you don't understand an area fairly deeply, or when you don't have access to others who can provide that resource, because obviously we can't know everything. Another thing that's very important is the ability to think outside of the box, creative thinking skills. Now, I did mention that we do differ a little bit in how naturally this comes to us. Some of us are much more creative or blue sky thinkers naturally. Some of us are not. The important point here, though, is that everyone can improve in this and everyone can be trained to some degree. And part of the job of leadership then becomes creating those opportunities, whether they're through training or whether they're through making changes in the job itself, in job design and in job interactions that are going to create opportunities for individuals to develop these kinds of skills. Finally, somebody might have really great creativity skills, and they might have all the resources and time and information and expertise they need to be creative, but if they are not intrinsically motivated, internally motivated to create, chances are they will not create. Now, I'm focusing here on this idea of internal motivation because creativity is something that requires a great deal of persistence, something that is challenging. There is no roadmap for being creative, and that means that sometimes creativity involves failure. That's a dirty word for us in the organization. And that's something that I'll come back to a couple of times as we go through this discussion today. The motivation to create really might be the most important of the three of these, because if you really want to make something happen creatively, you can go create and find opportunities to develop creative thinking skills even if you don't have them. You can go seek out resources, and if you can't have this yourself, you can go find others that can complement what you don't have. So of the three of these, this may be the most important because it's the one that provides the motive force and direction for what you need to do. Ultimately, though, the graphic highlights how all three of these are needed. Creativity lies at the intersection of appropriate resources, creativity thinking skills, and the motivation to create. Now, happily, that motivation may come from within, but organizations can affect that, both directly by enhancing our motivation and also through reward systems that are consistent with the idea of internal motivation.